My aunt said, "You'll never be good enough for this family." So I tracked down her secret son she'd given up for adoption and exposed her lies to the entire family. I can tell you about the day it all fell apart, because it's as vivid in my mind now as it was 15 years ago. Back then, I was just 20, fresh out of the only home I'd ever known in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The house was nothing special, an old Victorian my mom had scraped her savings to keep, but it was ours, worn carpet, creaky floors, and all. My mom was practically my only family. My dad had left when I was just a kid. I think he was a sculptor, or so he claimed, last I heard. Not that it mattered much, he hadn't sent so much as a postcard since he left. No, it was just my mom and me against the world. Well, us and my Aunt Brigida. She was my mom's older sister and the unspoken queen bee of our family, a title she'd apparently been gunning for since birth. Brigida was everything we weren't, wealthy, stylish, and brutal. She married Howard, an uptight businessman who could somehow endure Brigida's relentless nagging and judgments. They lived in a sprawling suburban home just outside Philadelphia, all polished floors, chandeliers, and a sprawling lawn, an entire world apart from our faded wallpaper and mismatched furniture. The few times I'd been inside her house as a kid, I was so scared of breaking something that I felt like I couldn't breathe. Still, it was Thanksgiving. I was young and trying, for once, to play nice, to put on my best normal niece act and smile as I passed the turkey. I even wore my one presentable sweater, a wool pullover my mom had bought me at a thrift store. The elbows were a little worn, but she'd patched them with care, and I'd been so grateful for it that I wore it even when it was a bit too warm for wool. I knew it wasn't the kind of put-together Brigida approved of, but I thought it was good enough. Apparently, I was wrong. After dinner, I went to the kitchen to help with dishes, just trying to stay out of sight, away from the pit of tension that always seemed to hover in the room when we were with her. My mom was drying dishes by the sink, looking tired as usual. I was scrubbing a stubborn spot on a platter when Brigida came in, hovering in the doorway, her heels clicking on the tile. "You really thought that sweater would do, Ramona?" she said with a half smile, as if she were sharing some kind of inside joke with herself. "I mean, honestly, are you even trying?" My hands froze on the dish. I felt a flush creep up my cheeks, and my mom glanced at me, giving me the silent just let it go look she'd perfected over the years. I should have kept quiet. I knew that. But something in me snapped. Maybe it was the years of feeling like the family's shameful little secret, the constant side-eye and snide comments. So I spoke up. "Maybe I don't have a closet full of cashmere, but this is my best, Brigida," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady, though my insides were churning. "Not everyone has the same resources you do." Brigida raised an eyebrow, clearly not used to me talking back. She took a step closer, crossing her arms, that cold blue stare zeroed in on me. "You think that sweater is your best?" she hissed. "Do you know what you look like, walking in here with that mess of a sweater and scuffed shoes? You're an embarrassment, Ramona. You'll never be good enough for this family. Not with that attitude, not with your whole situation." "Brigida." My mom snapped, her voice trembling with anger. I could tell she was holding back, though, not wanting to stir things up. "That's enough. She's trying her best. You don't have to be cruel." "Oh, I'm cruel?" Brigida shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You know what's cruel, Stella? Cruel is you bringing this charity case into every family gathering, expecting us to just sit here and pretend everything's fine. Maybe you don't mind settling for mediocrity, but some of us have standards." I could feel my pulse racing. My hands were shaking as I clutched the edge of the counter, fighting back tears, but the tears were tinged with anger. Years of it. I looked at her, trying to make my voice sound stronger than I felt. "You think you're better than us because you've got money? Because you married someone who bankrolls your lifestyle? You don't know the first thing about us, Brigida." "Oh, I know enough," she sneered. "I know you're a lost cause, just like your mother. You're both dragging this family down. If you had any respect for this family, you'd just disappear and spare us all." That was it. I turned to my mom, but she was looking down at the dish towel, silent, her shoulders slumped in defeat. I think that's what broke me more than anything, seeing her so worn down, so defeated, after years of trying to make things work. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't take it anymore. I shoved past Brigida, barely muttering "excuse me," and stormed out the back door, letting it slam shut behind me. The cold November air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't care. I kept walking, my steps echoing on the empty sidewalk as I made my way to the bus stop. I didn't even have my purse or phone. I was just done. My mom called me that night, begging me to come back, but I couldn't. I told her I was leaving Lancaster for good. I couldn't keep living in Brigida's shadow, couldn't keep being told I was worthless, a mistake as she'd so kindly put it. My mom tried to tell me that Brigida didn't mean it or that she was just old-fashioned, but I knew better. Brigida meant every word. I left Lancaster the next morning, boarding a Greyhound bus bound for New York City. I didn't have much, a backpack with a change of clothes, some cash I'd saved up from my part-time job at the diner, and a sense of desperation that I couldn't shake. But it didn't matter. I was free. New York was everything and nothing I expected. It was crowded, loud, and unforgiving. I started out crashing on the couch of a friend from high school, picking up shifts as a waitress at a 24-hour diner in Brooklyn. I worked night shifts, scraping by on tips, but I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being told I was a disappointment, a failure. I was just me. A few years later, I managed to land a job as a receptionist at a small real estate firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I found a tiny, crumbling apartment I could afford on my own in Bushwick. I worked long hours, rarely socialized, and kept my head down. It was lonely, sure, but it was peaceful. No Brigitte, no condescending stares, no whispered comments about how I was never going to make anything of myself. Just me, my work, and a sense of purpose. Then, out of the blue, came a call from my mom. She'd called a few times over the years, just to check in, but we'd never really talked about what happened at Thanksgiving. I think she was afraid to bring it up. This time, though, her voice sounded different, quieter, almost guilty. "Ramona," she began, there's something I need to tell you." I braced myself. I didn't know if I could handle more family secrets. But then she said, "I found a picture. One I haven't seen in years. It was your Aunt Brigitte, back when she was young, maybe 20, and, well, she was with a young man named Henry." The name didn't ring a bell, but I could hear the hesitation in her voice. "Who's Henry?" I asked, confused. My mom hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Brigitte had a son, Ramona. She gave him up for adoption before she met Howard. Our parents covered it up. No one in the family knew except me and them." I stared at the wall, stunned. It was like a puzzle piece clicking into place, but it didn't make sense. All these years of her preaching about standards, about family pride, and she'd hidden this? She never told anyone? I whispered, more to myself than my mom. "No," she replied. "She thought it would ruin her reputation, her image. So she kept it hidden, and she wanted everyone to think she was perfect, you know?" It was almost laughable, in a sad, bitter way. All the years of scorn, of her cutting remarks, her looks of disgust, while she had this secret buried deep. And I was furious, not just for myself, but for my mom and, oddly enough, for Henry, wherever he was. I started searching. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know who Henry was, where he was, if he was even alive. I wasn't sure what I'd do if I found him, but I knew I had to try. It took weeks of digging, online searches, and calling every agency I could think of. I even paid a private investigator for a while. Eventually, I found him, or rather, I found where he was. Henry lived just a few hours away, in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I wasn't even sure what I'd say, but I knew I had to go. The day I arrived at his house, my hands were shaking as I knocked on his door. He opened it after a minute, and for a second, he just stared at me, a polite but guarded look on his face. I swallowed hard, realizing this was the moment I'd been working toward for months. Standing before me was Henry, my Aunt Brigitte's hidden past, her shame she thought she'd buried forever. I didn't know what I'd expected, but he looked normal. Kind, even. He was in his early 30s, with brown hair and eyes that held a cautious curiosity. He was holding a mug of coffee, still warm and steaming in his hand. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but wary. I introduced myself, stumbling over my words at first. "Hi, Henry. My name is Ramona."
I think we might be related."
He looked at me, his eyebrows raising, and his expression shifted to confusion. I could see his mind trying to piece it all together. "Related? How?" I took a deep breath. This was the hard part, and I knew there was no easy way to say it. "Your birth mother. She's my aunt. Brigitte. She's my mother's sister." Henry's face went blank.
For a second, I worried I'd overstepped, that maybe he didn't want to hear this, but then his eyes sharpened.
He straightened up, closing the door behind him as he stepped outside with me.
I never knew much about my birth parents.
Just that I was adopted. That's all they told me." I pulled the photo from my bag and handed it to him. It was the same photo I'd found back in Lancaster, of Brigitte and Henry's father, taken long before she'd married Howard. Henry took it, staring at it in stunned silence. "She never told anyone," I continued, keeping my voice soft, "and she pretended like you never existed. Like you were. A mistake she could erase." I saw a flicker of pain cross his face, but he recovered quickly, nodding as if he'd expected nothing less. He looked back at me, his eyes searching mine. "Why are you telling me this?" I shrugged, feeling a mix of anger and relief. "Because she deserves to be exposed. All those years, she looked down on us, told me and my mom we were never good enough. She acted like we were the black sheep of the family, while she had this huge secret buried. I thought you had a right to know." He nodded slowly, taking it all in. I could see him wrestling with it, but then he looked back at me with a determined expression. I want to meet her, he said firmly. The idea made my heart race. Henry meeting Brigitte? Confronting her? It was more than I'd ever dared to imagine. But I nodded, feeling a surge of support for him. I'll be there with you, we'll go together. A week later, we were on our way to Brigitte's house. I hadn't told my mom yet, I wasn't sure how she'd react, and I didn't want to drag her into it just yet. This was for me and Henry. Brigitte had looked down on both of us, cast us aside like we were unworthy of her perfect life. It was time for her to face her past. We arrived at her house in the early evening. The grand, suburban home loomed over us, its carefully manicured lawn and spotless porch giving me a pang of bitter nostalgia. I remembered all the times I'd been here, trying to fit in, trying to be good enough. And now I was back, with Brigitte's secret standing right next to me. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding in my chest. After a moment, Brigitte opened the door, looking surprised to see me. Her eyes flickered to Henry, her expression shifting to confusion, then something darker. Ramona, she said, her voice cold. What are you doing here? I took a steadying breath, meeting her gaze without flinching. This is Henry, I said, nodding to him. You remember him, don't you? Brigitte's face went pale. She looked at Henry, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to speak, but no words came out. She took a step back, gripping the edge of the doorframe. I'm your son, Henry said, his voice calm but strong. The one you gave up. The silence that followed was heavy, like a thick fog settling over us. Brigitte stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and, for the first time, something close to fear. This is absurd, she finally stammered. I don't know what you're talking about. Henry didn't back down. You know exactly who I am, he said, his tone unwavering. You gave me up because I didn't fit into your perfect little life. And then you spent years treating Ramona and her mother like they were beneath you, all while hiding your own past. Brigitte looked at me, her eyes blazing with anger. How dare you come here and bring this into my home? I stepped forward, meeting her gaze. How dare you treat us like we're not good enough while you've been hiding this massive secret? All those years, Brigitte, you made us feel worthless. And now you can't even face the truth. Howard appeared in the hallway, looking confused as he came to stand beside her. What's going on? He asked, glancing between us. Henry looked at him, extending a hand. Hi, Howard. I'm Henry. Brigitte's son. Howard's face went pale as he processed what Henry was saying. He looked at Brigitte, his expression filled with shock and betrayal. Is this true? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Brigitte's face twisted, her carefully constructed composure crumbling as she looked at all of us, trapped. It was a long time ago, she snapped, her voice defensive. It doesn't matter now. It has nothing to do with you, Howard. Henry's voice was calm but devastating. It has everything to do with who you are, Brigitte. You wanted to erase me, to keep me a secret. You thought you could just pretend I didn't exist. But I'm here. And so is Ramona. You don't get to decide who's good enough anymore. Howard stared at her, his face filled with disgust. All these years, you've been lecturing everyone about family, about standards. And you've been lying to me this whole time? Brigitte tried to reach for his arm, but he pulled away, stepping back with a look that was more final than anything she could say. Howard, please. It was. I didn't think you would understand. Oh, I understand, he replied, his voice cold. I understand that you're a liar. That you've lied to me for decades. With one last look at her, he walked back into the house, slamming the door behind him. Brigitte stood there, looking lost, like a queen without her kingdom, her perfect facade shattered. I turned to Henry, a bittersweet satisfaction blooming in my chest. Are you okay? I asked him softly. He nodded, looking back at her with a calm resolve. I think I am now. Brigitte watched us, her face twisted with fury and disbelief. You've ruined everything, she spat. I smiled, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. No, Brigitte. You did that all by yourself. Without another word, Henry and I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway of her perfect house, alone and powerless. For the first time in my life, I felt free.